Sorry, just dinging a voice that just spoke to me. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I'm delighted that you've all shown up. And thank you so much to Neil. I promise you I wasn't paying him for PR. I promise you. This is voluntary. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be speaking for about 30 minutes. And I'm terribly sorry that I'm going to be reading part of that time, but at my age, you don't have a memory to sort of come up with 30 minutes worth of words. I would like to start, and then after that, we'll be talking, all of us, and hopefully you'll be asking questions, and really good ones. And so we'll have a discussion that'll go on for, I think, another hour if we have the time.
As long as we need, sure.
That's great. Yeah, I'm excited to hear people, but not till I'm finished, please. So I would like to begin by putting two numbers in front of you. Actually, one is a number and one is a statistic. In 1944, the year that I was born, the Nazis sent 800 Jews from Hungary to the gas chambers. That's the first number, 800,000. Growing up, I wondered, as I'm sure you all did at some stage in your lives, why did this happen? Why did nobody do anything? Where was everybody when this was happening? Certainly world leaders knew what was going on. So growing up, those were some of the questions that really bothered me. They really haunted my childhood. And I really do believe, looking sort of backwards on my life, that these were some of the questions that affected decisions that I later made. And then in May 2011, I caught sight of a newspaper headline saying that there were 27 million slaves in the world. Now, today, that number is 40.3 million. But who's counting, right? Cry of the Giraffe readers will remember that in February 1992, I bought and paid for just one of those 27 million, a young Jewish girl named Wuditu, and she should be up on the next screen. Neil, if you don't mind, if everything is working. There she is. That's Wuditu, pretty much the moment I found her. I have to say that luck was on our side that day, big time, really. Not only did I manage to find her in that enormous country and negotiate her purchase, but when the transaction sparked a mob attack on the two of us, we escaped only because at that moment, as readers may remember, there was a large gust of wind. Buying Wuditu constituted a classic slave trade. Shamefully, the act of buying a human being is not very different from buying a t-shirt, tube of toothpaste, pretty much anything. It's about money, right? We know that. So you hand someone a few tattered, smelly bills of local currency, in this case, Ethiopian birr, and they give you a human being. I paid 500 Ethiopian birr for Wuditu. I think on the next slide, we have a picture of one of them. It's really hard to tell how badly it smells from here, but trust me, it does. According to the market value then of 4.5 birr to the dollar, in case you're wondering how much a human being cost me at that moment, Wuditu cost me $111.11. This transaction would, by any standards, be considered a bargain because 3 decades later, Wuditu is giving back on a community level through her job as an Israeli healthcare worker. And on an international level, she's working with me and with some good Canadian friends to expose the story of child slavery in Ethiopia through an awareness campaign that we've called CAGE, campaign against abuses of girls in Ethiopia. Now, I'm a journalist and buying a slave is a big story. So don't you think it's strange that it took me 2 decades to write Cry of the Giraffe? Well, when I brought Wuditu home with me, she was very fragile and she was quite ill. And we were worried about how she'd feel if it became known that she'd been a slave. So we kept her story a secret, and I got on with the process of becoming her mother. Years later, after reading the diary of Anne Frank, Wuditu asked me to write Cry of the Giraffe. She realized that her personal story might help better to expose the conditions in Ethiopia than if I just quoted dry statistics, which I had been doing. So I was still really anxious to protect her identity. And so I put the book into the fiction category, and I changed all the names, and I added based on a true story, which I thought would give her an out if there was anything that she wanted to deny having happened to her. And over the next few years, I realized that what I'd written was essentially the diary of a slave. I began writing Cry of the Giraffe by interviewing Wuditu's relatives about what she'd been like as a child. I was really curious about what she'd been like growing up. Her aunt told me, in our language, Amharic, Wuditu's name means little treasure. And that's just what she was. She was cheerful, helpful, and pretty. But what was special about Wuditu was her long, elegant neck. As she strode confidently back and forth on her way to fetch water, the children in the village would call out to one another, "Hey, there goes that girl, you know, the one with the neck of a giraffe." Years later, that pretty, confident child became, at 13, a desperate woman. And this is how she described her situation. My hands were shaking when I stood over the fire that night. My mistress was asleep, so there was no time to lose. I put large chunks of soap in a pot of boiling water. I pounded and then blended in the heads of matches, and I stirred it all together. The smell was strong and I was afraid. I thought, what if this brew kills me as well as the baby? Who in my family would even know that I was dead? And even if they learned of my death, how would they know where to look for my body? So how did that once confident village child become that frantic girl performing a self-induced abortion? I'm going to briefly sum up Wuditu's story because I know that some of you have read the book. And after that, I'd like to tell you how I got involved. And finally, let's talk a little bit about how to get the word out about what's happening to girls in Ethiopia. Now, the next slide shows the very difficult walk to Sudan. You can see this was just the beginning. You see the mountains in the background. It gets much worse after that because then you have to go down. And people tell me that when they started going down, by the time they got to the bottom, they had such shin splints. And then, of course, there was the jungle, and then there was the desert, and then the water, the river to ford. And after that, the refugee camps. So Wuditu's story begins in the wake of Operation Moses, the secret airlift of Ethiopian Jews from Sudanese refugee camps to Israel. The thousands of Jews who walked to Sudan in the 1980s had a very clear idea of what they'd be facing, because those who'd already made it to Israel had written to them outlining how dangerous the trek would be, how difficult would be their stay in the refugee camps. And they also wrote about the unreasonably high death rate. Whenever possible, Israeli agents led the refugees to a remote place in the desert where planes landed on makeshift runways that had been quickly and secretly carved out by other Israeli operatives. Other planes carrying high-ranking Israeli officers circled overhead as the mission was taking place, ready in case anything went awry. Minutes after landing, the planes took off for Israel with as many Jews aboard as could be safely loaded onto planes whose interiors had been emptied of seats. Doctors treated the sick, and there were babies born on those flights. Those operatives who remained behind hurried to erase all evidence that planes had landed illegally in the desert. This was a country where Israelis were considered enemies, after all. The airlift of Ethiopian Jews represents the only time in human history that a first world nation, Israel, transported a large Black population out of Africa, not in order to enslave it or exploit it in any way, but simply in order to set it free. We have another slide coming up, please, Neil. Thanks. In 1989, Wuditu's father, Berihun, led his family on foot hundreds of kilometers from their village in northern Ethiopia to a refugee camp called Umrakba in eastern Sudan. A few months later, Wuditu, age 13, and Laute, age 10, were torn from their family and forced to walk all that way back to Ethiopia. Days later, Berihun's family was airlifted to Israel, leaving the two little girls alone on the African continent. Circumstances then separated the two girls, and Wuditu found herself alone in a market town named Ambergyorgis. She looked for work as a live-in servant to support herself until she could find help. But there was a brutal war being waged in the area, and people were afraid to take strangers into their homes. So she began to carry water for people in the town. She earned barely enough for a few pieces of injera bread at 10 centimes each. And at night, she rented a pallet in a local bar for 50 centimes a night. She knew it wasn't safe for a young girl to sleep there, but it was all she could afford. Inevitably, one night she was raped. Eventually, Wuditu found work as a live-in servant with a woman named Yelemwork, who over time proved to be a difficult mistress. But Wuditu had heard rumors that Jews were making their way to the Israeli embassy in the capital, Addis Ababa. From there, some Jews were managing to get to Israel. So now Wuditu had hope and a plan to save her wages for a bus ticket to the Israeli embassy in Addis Ababa, where she'd ask for help to find her family. Wuditu waited to be paid the 5 birr a month that she'd been promised. But instead, she was told that she'd incurred a debt. At the end of every month, there was always another debt to repay. Eventually, Wuditu realized that rather than having been hired as a servant, she'd actually been trapped into slavery. Over the next 2 years, Wuditu lived in fear because she'd been hiding the fact that she was a Jew. The local people hated and feared the Jews, believing that Jews could do them harm just by looking at them. What would happen, she wondered, if they found out that she was one of those Jews who, among other things, could turn into hyenas and eat Christian children? One day, Yelemwork discovered that she'd been unknowingly harboring a Jew. Wuditu was beaten mercilessly, and a debate raged over whether to kill her or to maim her. It's dangerous to have a Jew in our house, Yelemwork insisted, feeling betrayed and voting for Wuditu's death. But an older woman in the household had gotten fond of Wuditu, and she persuaded everyone to wait until morning before deciding what action to take. Run, she whispered to Wuditu. Save yourself. But experience had already taught Wuditu that to be free in the streets was even more dangerous than to be a slave. By a stroke of luck, I arrived in Ambergyorgis the very next morning looking for Wuditu. I still can't believe that coincidence. I'd been working as a journalist for the Jerusalem Post, and in 1985, as Neil told you, I took over the paper's charitable funds. I opened a 4th fund on behalf of Ethiopian Jews, and I began traveling through Israel with Jewish agency personnel, trying to determine what the country's needs were, what the community's needs were. I wrote about those needs in my weekly column. Money poured in from all over the world, including from Toronto, so thanks, guys. I set up a committee of people from the newspaper, from the Jewish Agency and from the Ministry of Welfare. Together, we started funding. So people who were carrying out work that was highly classified became my personal friends, came to know me not as a journalist who might betray their secret operations, but as someone who could sometimes help them with shortfalls in their budget. They began to call on me to perform various tasks within the Jewish Agency offices. And as far as I know, I was the only unaffiliated and unpaid person allowed to work for months at a time at their embassy in Addis Ababa, and then later, after the revolution, in their offices in Gondar province. If we can have the next slide, please, that would be great. Thank you. In 1985, a Jewish Agency social worker asked me to meet with a man named Yeshayahu, who was petitioning the Jerusalem Post funds for money to go to Ethiopia, bring his 6 family members to Israel. Yeshayahu explained to us that his family was under threat from the anti-Semitic Marxist regime. But funding this mission would have involved bribing Ethiopian passport officials, transferring large sums of foreign currency illegally out of Israel. So obviously my committee turned him down. But as I have mentioned, as a child, I'd wondered if more couldn't have been done to save people during the Holocaust. There was no comparison between those two sets of circumstances, obviously. But from what I learned about the brutality the Ethiopian Jews were facing, I realized that the principle of Jews at risk was the same. At breakfast, I told my kids about how sad I was at having to turn Yeshayahu down and how I just couldn't face him. They asked if we could raise money ourselves. So we dug into our overdraft and we raised the rest of the money from friends. Yeshayahu went off, but before he did, he explained to us that Ethiopia was now being ruled by Mengistu Haile Mariam, a brutal Marxist dictator, that he'd be followed everywhere and he'd be pretending to be a tourist. Months passed with no word from him. We became really anxious for his safety. Then I got a telegram saying, Ethiopia is a beautiful country. I'm having a great time, but it's expensive. Can you please send more money? An aunt of mine had recently died and left us $500. So we agreed to send it on to Yeshayahu along with more donations. At that time, we figured good money after bad, but we were already in, so what the? Months later, Yeshayahu phoned me from Ben Gurion Airport. He'd managed to bring his 6 relatives to Israel. And with that extra money, he'd also gathered and brought to Israel more than 25 Ethiopian Jewish children. And we have a picture of what Yeshayahu calls his first operation. Neil, if we could have the next slide. There they are. 1985, Yeshayahu's first group. Yeshayahu then surprised me by saying, you'll be glad to know that I've paved the way for future operations. I groaned. I had never planned to do this again. I'd been really nervous it was like something like 6 months that he'd been away. But the next morning, Yeshayahu had a list of people with missing relatives asking for help. And my phone was ringing off the hook. So we started on the next case, and eventually I left the newspaper and gathered an informal group of people to carry on the work with us. Most of our cases involved raising money to send people to look for their missing relatives. When there was no one from that family who could go, one of us went instead. Once it was proved that the people we'd located had a right to immigrate to Israel, the Jewish Agency would take over their care and we could leave the issue and go on to our next case. In 1989, the group decided that it was my turn to go to Ethiopia. At the time, I had no knowledge of Wuditu's family. My assignment was to locate and assist a different family, one that was in distress. If we could have the next slide, please. While I was there, a staffer at the Israeli embassy asked me if I would please keep an eye on a little girl named Laute. There she is with the devil in her eye, and she's still got it. Laute's parents and siblings have been airlifted from Sudan to Israel. But Laute was really ill, and she couldn't quite explain how she'd managed to get from Sudan to Addis Ababa and to the Israeli embassy. So I did look after the child for about 2 months while I was there. And when her passport arrived, she was sent off to Israel and reunited with her family. When I got back to Israel, Berihun told me that another daughter had also been taken from him in Sudan. He was terribly ill, as you can see from the photograph we had before. So he paid a man to go and look for Wuditu, but the man returned reporting that Wuditu was dead. Fearing that he would soon die, Berihun begged me to take Laute into our family, which we did. She was the same age as my son Jonathan, and they seem to be getting along pretty well. We actually have a picture of the two of them together on the next slide. She tends to be a little bit mischievous with Jonathan, but so far they're getting along okay. Ethiopia was by now coming under increasing pressure from the rebel army. Over 2,000 Jews had come from the villages to the Israeli embassy in Addis Ababa, hoping to get to Israel. But the Ethiopian government was allowing very few Jews to leave the country, and there was increasing fear about what might happen to the Jews when the rebel army entered the city, as we were pretty sure it would do at any moment. A veritable factory for writing reunification forms was set up in the Jewish Agency headquarters in Tel Aviv, and I was asked to help because I had some knowledge of the language. I spent my days creating reunification requests that described fictional connections between people who had most likely never met and most likely never will. In May of 1991, I was asked by Ze'ev Schwartzberg, who was then head of the Jewish Agency's Ethiopia desk, to write a letter that would express the dire necessity for the US to help bring about a mass airlift. Ze'ev and I created a very affecting document, which was given to Senator Rudy Boschwitz to take to the US Senate. I have no idea whether that letter had any influence or not, but an agreement was bartered by then President George Bush Sr. The rebels agreed to hold off entering the city until the Israelis could airlift the Jews. Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir gave El Al permission to fly on Shabbat. And over the weekend of May 24, 25, 1991, Operation Solomon airlifted 14,325 Jews to Israel in 36 hours, while the rebel army sat chain smoking just outside the grounds of the airport. We have another slide coming up, please. Yeah. As the first planes were waiting to take off, I got a call from the Jewish Agency to help out at the Diplomat Hotel in Jerusalem. One of my first assignments was to do medical evacuation of the sick, and after that, to help the new immigrants fill out their forms for their te'udot zehut, their identity papers. At one point, I got an urgent call to use my basic Amharic to clear the children out of the hotel's elevators. The kids had figured out how to make the elevators go up and down, and no one could get anywhere in the multi-story building. That elevator reminds me of a story told here in Toronto by the Ethiopian Jewish rabbi, Harav Sharon Shalom. That must have been about 2 or 3 years ago when he was here. So Harav Sharon Shalom was in that same building as Operation Solomon was winding down. He spied an old man standing in front of the elevator. The doors opened and an old woman entered the elevator. The doors closed, and as the man was frantically trying to figure out how to rescue the disappearing lady, the doors opened again and a much younger woman got out. Pretty sure I think you know where this is going. The old man made a beeline for his wife, convinced that if he could just find a way to get her into this magic box, it would no doubt send forth a much younger wife. When I got home after the operation, one night I got woken up by the sound of crying. I came into Laute's room and I find her crying over a letter that she's writing. I ask her, who are you writing to? Why are you crying? It's 3 a.m. Sure you don't want to go back to sleep? She says, I'm writing to my sister. Well, she had several sisters in Israel, quite a large family, lots of siblings. So I said, well, why don't we wait, go back to sleep? And in the morning, I'll call one of your sisters and we'll find out what the address is. And she said, no. She said, I'm writing to my sister Wuditu in Ethiopia, and I don't know the address. Oh no, I thought, she's writing to a person who is no longer alive. When I finally figured out how to ask her that, why are you writing to someone who's no longer alive? She said, my sister can't be dead. I feel her breathing. Literally in those words. So in 1992, I went back to Ethiopia to look for the presumed dead sister of a child who I had by now come to love. Laute told me that her sister had gone to Amba Georgis to look for help and had planned to come back, but never did. So I interviewed everyone in Israel who had passed through the town on their way to the Israeli embassy. One man thought he'd seen Wuditu there. From her ragged, emaciated appearance, he thought she just might be trapped into slavery. He thought she was ill and suggested that maybe it might be too late to go and look for her. Clearly, there was no time to waste, but I wasn't sure how I could safely get to Amba Georgis, which was in the middle of a war zone. One evening, my hotel clerk told me that 2 Italian tourists had come to the hotel. He laughed at the idea of tourists coming to Ethiopia in the middle of a revolution. He thought that was hysterical. The Italians had hired a driver and government taxi to take them north. They planned to go climbing in the Semien mountain range. I knew they'd have to drive straight through Amba Georgis in order to get there, so I persuaded the Italians to let me share their taxi. We stopped at a mud kiosk in the center of Amba Georgis. The taxi was immediately surrounded by people, one of whom looked like a bandit in an old Hollywood movie. He had a rifle slung on his shoulder, a knife and a revolver in his belt, and a strap of bullets across his chest. He said he knew where Wuditu was, but it would take him a while to bring her to the kiosk. I said we were heading north to drop off the Italians and I'd be back in the afternoon. If he could bring Wuditu unharmed, I emphasized, to the kiosk, I would pay him. If we could have the next slide, please. When the Italians left to go climbing, I discovered that my driver had vanished. He'd gone to buy a sheep to sell. He was hoping to make a two-beer profit if he bought it in Amba Georgis and sold it in Gondar city. So for the rest of the day, the animal lay in the trunk of the taxi, bleating loudly and stinking up the car. Back in Amba Georgis, a huge crowd was waiting for us. The bandit opened the door and threw a white shrouded lump into the back seat. There she is, he said, with his hand on his revolver. Now pay me. Those of you who've read Cry of the Giraffe know that the day actually ended well, but on a completely terrifying note. Again, that gust of wind comes into the picture. But rather than going on with Wuditu's story, what I'd like to do is to tell you what's been happening to us since that day in Amba Georgis. Wuditu's experience was a classic case of debt bondage. She thought she'd been hired as a servant, but kept incurring more and more debt. Only then did she understand that she'd been trapped into slavery. In fact, hundreds of thousands of girls are trapped into debt bondage in Ethiopia. But it's not the only kind of child slavery that exists there. Far from it. During my research, I actually thought of creating a series of books, each of which would tell the story of another kind of Ethiopian female slavery. In the book I'm working on now, one of the characters is bride kidnapped at the age of 12, becomes pregnant and is then afflicted with obstetric fistula, a condition the World Health Organization calls one of the worst afflictions known to humankind. I won't describe fistula to you now. If you type in fistula in Ethiopia or bride kidnapping in Ethiopia into your browser, you'll find that there are hundreds of thousands of similarly afflicted girls in that country. The point of all this is to get the word out about child slavery in Ethiopia, get it out into the public forum as quickly as we can. And now, with war spreading from Tigray province to other areas of Ethiopia, the plight of these girls has to be even more dire. There is some good news, however. Wuditu is doing incredibly well and is now the mother of my fabulous little grandson. And the Canada Media Fund last year awarded my son Daniel Oron, a Canada-based producer, with a grant to make a movie of Cry of the Giraffe. So get your dresses ready for the red carpet. Wuditu and I are hoping that with the Cage campaign, with the books, the movie, and talks like this, word about what's happening to girls in Ethiopia will finally make it into the headlines. Now, I'd like to thank you for listening so patiently, but before I stop speaking, I'd like to show you 4 more slides. So, Neil, if we can have it. So this was Wuditu's first weekend in Israel at my home. Laute, as I said, has a bit of a devil in her eye, and she's always trying to, at that time when she was a child, she was always trying to plait our hair. And then we'd shake our heads, Jonathan and me, and she would get angry because all her hard work came to nothing. The next slide. Wuditu and Daniel that first weekend went out for coffee. You can see that she looks really tired. She was having a really hard time. It must have been absolutely strange to her. Daniel had just come back from his first weekend off at the army, and she went into immediate hero worship of an Israeli soldier. They're the same age, and luckily Laute and Jonathan are the same age, which really helped a lot. The next slide was at the launch of Cry of the Giraffe. Wuditu she's been a really good daughter, but the one thing that she always made difficulties about was speaking English. She actually can, but pretends that she can't. And so she insisted that at the launch, she would speak in Hebrew and Daniel would translate for her. And that's me in the corner, smiling with tears going down my eyes. And the last one that I want to show you is what I call my chutzpah picture. This is the before and after slavery. Thank you all so much for listening so patiently. Neil, over to you.
Thank you very much. Just open this up. It's a hard story. There's no doubt about that. And sadly, the story is still continuing, if not for Jewish Ethiopians, just for Ethiopians in general. And this is, for those who know me, even beyond AGPI, this is an atrocity that we don't talk about for a number of reasons. And I think to center myself, it plays into the, well, that's Africa discussion, which is heartbreaking. I've done a lot of learning, especially in and around, and I apologize for mispronouncing it, but it's the, can you hear me?
Someone is saying that your sound is going in and out, and you're speaking from Avi's.
Yes, I'm speaking from Avi. Oh, it does say Avi Ben Lalo.
This is Neil and not Avi.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm Neil. Can you hear me okay? Okay.
I hear you fine. Yeah.
Just the discussion around obstetric fistula. And then there's that portion in the book about giving herself an abortion. And pieces around bride kidnapping and slavery. And these are the heartbreaking pieces. Aside from the fact that every child deserves to have a childhood, no matter where they're born in the world, the reality is that this is what we deal with every day. And I wonder if you can talk, I've got some hard-hitting questions first. I'm going to pretend I'm a journalist, but it's something that I've encountered just in my own work. And for the rest of you, please feel free to add questions, comments, things you want her to elaborate on or want to know more about. I'm gonna start with this question, and I'm not sure if you can answer them all, but I'm gonna play with the first one. For those of you who don't notice, Judie is not from Ethiopia, both from heritage and by culture. So Judie, the question I have you ever encountered a white savior complex claim from people that hear about your story and say, as a white woman, you've gone into Africa and adopted these children? And if anyone has ever said that, what have you spoken? How have you sort of diffused that?
Wow.
That's the hard-hitting question.
You guys aren't going to ask the easy questions, even if I
Oh,
beg.
my next ones are easy. I want to get the ball rolling. I'm going to be the bad guy.
Can you actually formulate a question in like 5 words? Because I'm not totally sure what that question was.
Okay, so from people who've read your book or people that know the story, has anyone ever claimed that this story is a story about a white savior complex?
I don't know what people are thinking. I don't actually get that a lot, but what I did run into, and I think you and I talked about this. 2 years ago, I finished writing The Kidnapped Bride and sent it off merrily to all kinds of publishers, and the response was unanimous. If you can write this book as nonfiction, we love the backstory. You obviously have writing chops, I was told, whatever that means. And there's no way, we will be punished if we publish the book of a white woman about brown people. I tried to explain, I speak the language, I raised 2 kids. I went, no, didn't help, didn't get me anywhere. So this turned out to be really fortunate in the end, because I'm working with Yeshayahu as my co-author, and he is just adding so much. So on that whole subject, I'm answering a different question from
That's okay, because this is where I wanted it to go.
But in actual fact, this whole issue of cultural appropriation taught me a lesson, because I'm not Ethiopian. It doesn't matter that I've spent 40 years in the community. It doesn't matter that practically everybody I know is Ethiopian. I'm still not an Ethiopian. And it's amazing how much Yeshayahu has managed to contribute, and hopefully will make the book better. He's not just there because he's brown. He's there because he's brilliant, and he's really adding a lot. So I did not answer your question.
You know what? That's okay. And I think, even speaking about this cultural appropriation piece, I think is important to consider that we need to be weary that sometimes, there's an African proverb, and my students have heard me say, until the lion learns to speak, the hunt always glorifies the hunter. But on the flip side, sometimes we not only have to empower the lion to speak, but sometimes the hunter has to give the lion a voice. And in this case, I'm not seeing you as a hunter, but I'm seeing you as the person that's giving a voice to not just, Wuditu, but to the girls today, right? The 22 others that are here today. And that's sort of where I'm seeing this. I'm going to continue asking questions until people put other ones in, so don't worry. You mentioned Jews as hyenas. And now I know where that comes from, but maybe some of our viewers here, our participants may not. Can you explain that, Jews as hyenas, a little bit?
I actually can't. I just know that Ethiopians are convinced that I should not have said that. Wipe it out, erase. During the period the Jews were living in Gondar province, there were a lot of crazy stories about what they could do. And so there was a lot of fear of the Jews, fear and hatred. First of all, they were very different. They practiced a different religion. The local population, by and large, had no education, had many of them never even seen electricity or running water. So the ignorance level was high. The Jews, for a lot of reasons that I won't go into right now, helped to to stay alive by falling back on their crafts. And so a lot of countries, not just Ethiopia, but a lot of countries in Africa, there is a belief that if you have knowledge from somewhere else and nobody else has that knowledge, just your group of people, you must have gotten that knowledge through a pact with the devil. And so that's where a lot of that comes from. And hyenas do eat Christian children, but in general, during that period of time and in that geographical part of Ethiopia, anything odd that happened that people couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation for it, it would be the Jews that were blamed.
And so that I'm glad that you quantified at the beginning that, a race, yes. Because so I encountered the Jews as hyenas metaphor in Rwanda. To me, it seemed very Eastern African belief, right? So there was this idea that Jews spoke a different language, practiced a different way of life. And as you mentioned, must have had a pact with the devil. And so it makes it easier to hunt humans when we don't see them as humans. And so you look back at Jews as dogs, Jews as hyenas, right? But I mean, that's only within Jews. We've seen it with so many different racialized, marginalized, and oppressed groups that as soon as you dehumanize them, it makes it easier to inflict hate on them. Cockroaches. We heard it in Rwanda that cut down the tall trees. And then this belief that not only Jews were hyenas, but Jews were shapeshifters. So there was this practice of witchcraft, which plays into this idea of mysticism and so on. And so I'm glad that you pointed out this Jews as hyenas, because that's not a metaphor. That was something that is spoken about. And I circled it in the book when you make these claims, and I found it interesting. Zainab has a great question. Zainab, do you want to read it, or would you like me to read it?
I can read it.
Thank you very much.
I said, how has the Ethiopian people received your book? I wonder if you received a pushback from them. And I'm only asking that question because I do know Ethiopians are very nationalistic. They're very prideful. They're very to their government. So I want to know if you received any pushback from them. And yeah, that is my question.
It's a great question.
It's a good question. Thanks, Zainab. So the book was translated into Hebrew. The book is about Jews and about people who became Israelis. And so when the book was translated into Hebrew, it was a big kerfuffle all over the place. There were a lot of interviews. There were a lot of articles in the paper. It was in the bookstore, in the window of every bookstore. And I was lucky that there was only one pushback out of all of that. And that pushback, someone explained to me that I had in my acknowledgements, I had acknowledged a man named Zimna Birhani, who unfortunately died 3 years ago. And he was my teacher. He was my astamari, my teacher in Amharic. And this is a woman who apparently has a feud with, their family has a feud with Zimna's family. So I was told, don't pay any attention to it. I have no idea, but that was the only pushback I got. But when I came back to Canada, I did get a lot of pushback from people who read the book, people who came to my lectures. And I'm not always sure how to handle it. I as a Jew, I was trying to help other Jews. I wasn't running around, say West Africa, rescuing people. And there have been complaints about, pushback about that. Well, if you had heard of somebody else who was in trouble, would you have gone to do, A, B, or C? I've been talking in two languages on 3 continents now since 2010 when the book came out, and I've had a lot of questions thrown at me, some of them unpleasant. There's that thing about if you put yourself in front of, in the public forum, people feel they can ask anything. So there's been some very painful questions over the years. Yeah.
It's a good question, and especially bringing in that nationalistic piece, because, you and I, when we had spoken, we talked that, yeah, this is a Jewish story, right? It's a story about Jewish girls, the migration back to Israel, but I read it today in 2020.
No, and I have to say that I've been working now, with no payment for several years, coming up to almost 4 years, for people who are not Jewish.
There was a question earlier. Oh, sorry, go on. Sorry.
But having, buying a human being changed my life. It's not just because Wuditu became my best friend, my daughter, my everything, but because that process was so humiliating for both of us. So not just because she pushes me to keep going, but also because I forget that day. And I'm going to do whatever I can to get the story out. Angelina Jolie did a movie called Defret about bride kidnapping. And she couldn't get the story out into the public forum. It lasted 2 days on the screen and vanished, never to be heard from since.
And I'll be sharing that link later with everybody.
It's a tough job. For some reason, what happens in Ethiopia, if it doesn't have to do with war or with famine, it just doesn't get out there. And I'm hoping, with people like Neil coming on board, with my amazing people from Cage, I'm just really hoping that story will get out there and help will come to these girls.
And as a teacher, that's what I want. And so I'm glad. So my first question, which talked about white savior, which we then talked about cultural appropriation and representation, but then Zainab's question about nationalism and representation of another culture. And so that's why I'm happy that this story is coming out, because I think we need to mobilize just more people to be aware, not just of the tragedies. And we're going to go back, because you spoke to me once about the female frame, the body. And can you speak to that? And because that's the piece that, after all of our conversations, the one that haunts me the most.
I'm not quite sure I remember what that conversation was.
The idea of what happens when these young ladies are pregnant, okay, and then what happens to their future. And I guess trigger warning to 2021. But I want to bring this forward because for me, it's about contextualizing and the realities. And majority of us, with the exception of 2 of us, are female. And I think that we need to better understand that we talk about child slavery. We talk about, bride kidnapping. It's horrific. But what are the true consequences?
Okay, you asked.
I'm asking, and I know where I'm going. And so trigger warning with the rest of you.
Okay. You can always mute me. So, I could talk a little bit about what happens to my character in this novel that Sheo and I are working on. And what happens to my character, Almaz, is what happens to hundreds of thousands of girls. girls who live in a warm climate matriculate earlier than girls who live in a cold climate. And so generally, the girls that are kidnapped are somewhere between 10 and 14. My character is 12. And what she goes through is not different from what other girls in Ethiopia are going through, or anywhere else in the world, not just in Ethiopia. So very quickly they become pregnant, but their body is too small and too underdeveloped. Their body is ready to become pregnant, but it is not ready to successfully carry a child to birth. And so a large percentage of these women wind up with a hole. A fistula is a hole that happens when the baby is struggling to get through a birth canal that is too small for him. And so there will be a hole that will cause a leak of urine. And if they're really even more unlucky, they'll also, or instead of, have a hole that means that they're leaking feces. And then they are so smelly and dirty, there's no way to keep themselves clean. They are generally thrown out of their house because no family can bear the smell and the terrible mess. And so these girls either die in some hut somewhere all alone of infection, lack of care. They have no idea, most of them, because they live in really remote areas. And in Ethiopia, there are areas, you saw the mountains. That was really the downhill. If they had gone if we had taken a picture of a farther northern area like Simien, girls there might have to walk as much as 50, 60 kilometers just to get to a paved road. And the chances of a bus or a car ever coming along to take them anywhere, it's not going to happen. And most of them have never seen a case like that because they're living in very isolated villages. So they have no idea that what happened to them happens to millions of girls, and that there's a cure, a very simple and brief operation. And that there's actually in Addis Ababa a hospital that is dedicated to operating on girls with fistula. That hospital was founded by an Australian missionary couple of gynecologists who thought they were coming for 2 or 3 years to Ethiopia, and who in the end came across these heartbreaking cases of fistula, of these young girls, 10, 11, 12 years old, whose lives were over, but who somehow had managed to hear and somehow managed to get to the hospital. And we're also talking about a country where very few people ever see actual money. They probably barter bread for whatever, or anything for anything. So to get money for a bus would be an unheard of. If Wuditu had been able to get money for a bus, her life would have changed. So unfortunately, the woman, the husband of this this Australian couple died a few years ago. The wife, the female gynecologist, Dr. Catherine Hamlin, Hamlin, she died only a few months ago. She was not only working to create this, to keep this hospital going, to raise money for it, but she was also creating satellite small hospitals throughout Ethiopia, where they were teaching midwives to successfully birth these young girls and to go out into the countryside and look for these girls who were pregnant. Unfortunately, they were only able to do something like 5,000 fistula operations a year. And there are hundreds of thousands of girls in this situation. When I read, there's a movie about them, which the hospital put out. And at that point, I think that was maybe 4 years ago, they were there was a waiting list of 100,000 girls, and they could only do 5,000 operations a year. So.
Thank you. I know it's hard to talk about, but even reading in the comments, like, why haven't we heard about this? And, you know, this seems like a stretch for the Abraham Global Peace Initiative. But to me, as an organization, we're founded on peace above all else. We're founded on dialogue and just education. I mean, right off the bat, you spoke about the fact that you bought her for 500 beer, the equivalent of $111. I want the rest of you to reflect on how much you paid last time you went out for dinner.
Yeah.
So I went to the Keg tonight with my two boys and my wife, and we spent $172 on dinner.
Yeah.
And to save someone's life, you spent 111. And you know, this is not an easy conversation, which is why we're here. Because, you know, can we take up the work of Hamlet? So I put her book there, The Hospital by the River, which Judie, you and I had spoken about. I got to scroll up. I just kind of.
She was, by the way, at one point up for a Nobel Peace Prize, but she didn't win. But she was about 7 or 8 years ago. She was a she was a CNN hero.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So one of the earlier questions: how did the slaves in Ethiopia incur the debt, as you mentioned, that they become slaves because they had a debt to their employees or employers and mistresses? So how does this debt occur?
They're basically made up. They're fictitious. So, for example, if you remember in Cry of the Giraffe, with Yelamurk felt that in order to hold her head up, her servant shouldn't be in rags. And so she gave her the rags that she had been prepared to donate to the church. So that first month, Wuditu's debt was to pay her back for the rags that she was wearing. One point, her hair was messy, and Yelamurk felt like she couldn't bear to have this woman going to the market with her with messy hair. So she gave her a black kerchief to put over her head. So the next month there was an inflated price of how much money she owed. And you know, it kind of reminds me in a way of what happened after the American slaves were freed, but basically they were still stuck on the land where they had been, a large percentage of them. And then there was the company store. And so if they wanted to buy anything, they had to buy it through the company store. And they got into debt and essentially were still slaves.
There's a similar, not the same, but a similar parallel that can be drawn with post-apartheid South Africa, when I'm going to use the term plantation. That's not the right word, but when the farms turned hands, you know, the Black workers on these farms still couldn't afford. Yeah, they, you know, that we now have equality, we now have freedom, but we still couldn't afford. And so cycles of poverty continue. Yeah. And then, you know, we always look and say, well, what, you know, are you, you know, what can you do about this? And so sorry, go on.
Sorry, I mean, really, we're horrible. We interrupt people. It's a national pastime. So Catherine Hammond's death is really in some ways a death blow to attempts to, you know, push this forward. You know, while she was alive, she was actually still operating at 94. But she was also working with various friends of the hospital in different parts of the world to raise money so that she could keep going. So the fact that she just recently died, that's really a death blow. You know, so the fact that you, Neil, and, you know, the Abraham Global Peace Initiative and all of you around here are listening, and we're hoping to find ways to get that story out, to get some help for these girls.
Well, I can tell you now that looking at, you know, the participants here, I would say at least half of you are my students. And you're not just my students, but you're going to be social science educators. And, you know, I always say that if you're not better than you were yesterday, then make sure you're better tomorrow. And so that should be the piece that guides you. Today, you didn't know about this. What are you going to do now in your own schools, in your own communities to take on the legacy that we're now introduced, whether it's making books like this mandatory reading in our English classes, our science classes, we can engage in conversations about reproduction and the female body. We could talk about this in terms of climate and geography, history, modern history, because this is still happening today. We can talk about business. We can talk about bondage and slavery. There's a lot, you know, the cross-curricular pieces. There are a couple of questions today. Let's be a little bit more positive.
Again, I'm interrupting. Sorry.
Yeah, we're both Israeli, so that's okay. I'm used to it.
Now you tell me. You and I had a conversation a couple of days ago, and you were talking about, I can't remember, you had a lovely phrase about fixing things, where something is financially viable to be fixed or not. I can't remember what was that phrase you
wicked problems.
Wicked problems.
Wicked problems.
Into wicked problems. Well, this is a problem where it doesn't really take a lot of money even to fix. You know, you can't even say, well, it's going to be billions. No, it's not going to be billions. Tell us about that phrase, because I really love that.
So the term wicked problem first came to fruition, I think, in the 1960s to really describe complex problems that are so big we don't know where to start. So we look for band-aids, really. Climate change is a wicked problem, right? They say that the HIV/AIDS pandemic is a wicked problem. And, you know, the desalinization of the oceans are wicked problems, that they're so big that I can't fix it, Mary can't fix it, Aviva can't, not even one country. And so what we do is then we look for different ways that we can tackle it by really not doing anything. And so we bring in notions around design thinking. We look for things like, we don't have to necessarily deal with climate change, but that sometimes the solution has nothing to do with the problem. And the example I used was the genocide in Sudan, Darfur. You may be familiar with STAND, Students Taking Action Now, Darfur. What ended the genocide was not military planes flying over the Darfur region. It wasn't about the liberation of death camps on the Chad border. What it was children, high school students with cell phones. And what changed the world were students around North America that emailed, at the time Clinton and then Obama, that emailed our prime ministers and said, we need to stop.
Yeah.
And because of that, because it only takes 20 letters for any congressman, senator, MP, MPP, 20 phone calls, emails, text messages before they have to stand up in their legislature. And most people don't know that 20 is the magic number amongst your constituents to stand up and say, my constituents want. In the first week, there were 1 million phone calls to the White House from teenagers in classrooms with one of these. So sometimes the end of a genocide was a kid in St. Louis making a phone call to the White House. Mm-hmm. The largest army in the world, people say, is China. I disagree. The largest army is a teenager with a cell phone. It's the only thing that ever changes the world.
Wow.
And, on a positive note, Daniela was asking, so, you know, this is a tragic story, but it's a story also of hope. And so what do your daughters do now? Are they in school? Are they in the army? Will they write their life story? Oh, I keep breaking this chair. Stop. Tell us some nachas. Give us some joy.
All right. Well, Laute had a difficult time in school. She was not happy to be in school. So she coasted along. And in the end, what she really wanted was to get married and have kids. And that's what she's done. She's really, really happy. She's got 3 fabulous. I mean, I have to say, these girls have produced great grandchildren. And she's working in elder care and she loves the work. She complains that she would like me to go there so she can take care of this ancient person rather than the ones that she is taking care of. Wuditu, I don't even know if I'm the right person to talk about her because she's just pretty amazing. First of all, you don't expect a person who was recently so abased that if you looked at her, she would actually bow with her head onto the ground because that's how she had to answer people. You don't expect someone to come 2 or 3 days later and make jokes, but she's actually a stand-up comedian. She's in the wrong profession. She's really funny. And there's just lists and lists of things that she said over years that I'll just give you one example. I remember being on a bus with Wuditu and Laute, and there was a woman sitting on the other side of the aisle staring at us, which we were used to. And eventually she stands up and she comes over to me and she says in Hebrew, I don't know quite how to translate this into English, but she's saying, "Ech makablim ka'ele." How do you get things like that? She was as though you're saying things about the people that are standing next to me. And at that moment, Wuditu stood up and pointed out the window of the bus and said, "Madam, only for today, 2 for the price of 1 at that supermarket. You should get off right now or you'll miss the sale." And the 2 of us were like, but when you spend time with her, that's kind of what you have to do. So I remember once going into the elevator in our building and someone who should have known better knew that Wuditu assumed that she was from some African country. I hear terrible noises around.
Yeah, sorry, I think the bar is just down that way. So
okay, just as long as they don't have their hockey sticks with them, then we're safe. But
they're actually starting to come in.
there were people standing next to me at the elevator in Wuditu, and one of them says to me, "Oh, it's so good that Judie finally has someone to clean for her," because she just assumed that she was from some African country cleaning, right? Foreign worker. Quick as anything, Wuditu looks at her and says, "Madam, look at me. Do I look African? I'm from Russia." The ride up the elevator was very quiet. When we got up to our was then the 9th floor, basically said, you have to be careful. That woman was really old. She could have had a heart attack.
Darwin. Right.
She works in healthcare. She managed. The first year after she came and I put her in school, I would get these teachers calling me and crying and saying, "We don't know how she did it. She's so smart. How did she write this? How did she write this assignment?" She went from having something like maybe a 3rd grade education in Ethiopia, a very bad 3rd grade education. Within 1.5 years, she was at university.
Right.
I think she's probably the smartest person I've ever met.
Amazing.
$4.11.
Callously, and this is going to be a very ill-timed comment, and please, because it's the best money ever spent. And I don't I'm cringing when I say a comment like that.
I know. I used to make jokes at her and I'd say to her, "Well, $111.11 and you don't do windows, Fortunately, she would laugh, but
You can make the joke. I can't. Mary, I know that you wanted to add something earlier. I want to turn. So Mary is a good friend of mine that we've crossed paths quite a few times. And I'm officially labeling her the Abraham Global Peace Initiative's country chair of both Ireland and the United Kingdom. And she's joined us many times and I'm learning quite a bit. So Mary, what would you like to add here?
I'm just looking at you now, right? Hi.
It was just something that Neil said to you about the great white savior and things like that. And my cousin here in Ireland, she had tried for many, many years to have children and she couldn't. And she decided she was going to Romania to adopt. And she adopted, or she went over with her husband. And when he went back to the hotel to get their passports, she had decided she was going to take Terry, a little girl, and a little boy pulled on her skirt and kept saying "Mama" in the orphanage, and she said she couldn't leave Stephen behind, so they ended up spending a long time trying to make sure that they got both, but they adopted both children, Stephen and Terry. But they did meet with some, not much, but enough to actually feel that they couldn't stay in Ireland anymore. You know, at the time, you know, certain times when they were on the bus or on a train, one or two people negative comments about how Terry didn't look Irish, but Stephen did, and he's obviously your child, but she's clearly not. And she just felt, so she, at the time she was working for a big company, the same company as me in Ireland, but she moved to America after that, and they spent most of their many years in America before they actually came back to Ireland in the end. But they were met with mostly positive, 99.9% positive, but it was the one or two negative comments that were enough to make her husband feel, look, we can't stay here. I don't want Terry or Stephen hearing those comments.
Of course.
Just wondering, were you faced with the same? Because clearly you were a family unit, but clearly you were both culturally different, if you like, or certainly visually culturally different.
Yeah.
Whether you know, did you experience that? Because it's hard to avoid with people. People tend to have what we say in this country, verbal diarrhea. They say something, they just think, and
Yeah.
especially older generations. And some of them, like this man was probably well-meaning in that he came over and said to her husband, I hope you haven't kidnapped that child, because she's clearly not yours. And that was enough to put them over the edge and force them out of to take a job in America, in Colorado. But yeah, that's all I want to say.
Oh, thanks for telling us this. And they've come back, you say, and how are they doing now?
Well, yeah, they came back to Ireland for many years. My cousin is no longer alive, but it was tragic, really, what happened. But she died. But her children are still living here in Ireland, and her husband. So yeah. So it was just, it was hard. And funnily, she was very, very dark, sallow, very dark haired. And the little girl looked so like her. Terry looked so like her. Stephen looked so like her husband. But that shouldn't have mattered.
Yeah.
Do you know what they looked like? What color their skin was? It was just enough to. It was in the 80s as well. It was 1984, so it was early days, and Ireland wasn't as equipped, I suppose, with immigration and things like that, and people coming into the country. So they were met with, at the very least, glances. Did you experience that?
I think when the kids were younger and with me, they certainly never told me that they'd had those kind of experiences. I think they were both going to school with my sons.
Yeah.
Who were rather large, tall, kind of. I know that my younger son had a couple of times told me that he had beaten people up because they made fun of another kid who was Ethiopian. Because don't forget, they were in, you know, there were there's like 150 odd or 140 odd Ethiopian Jews in Israel now. So, and there's a the previous wave many decades ago were from Yemen, so they were dark skinned as well. So it's not like everybody in Israel looks like me, you know. It's a very varied group of people. But I do know that when they moved out and kind of were on their own, after they left home, they have had experiences where people have pointed out, you know, that they are different. And unfortunately, you know, with all the excitement that the immigration of Ethiopian Jews was met when they first came, there have been incidents.
Yeah.
Not perfect.
So such a less people are out now. And I think that that's sort of the piece that I want everyone to take, is the fact that it sparks a larger conversation about how we begin to look at communities and how we begin to check our own bias. You know, when this woman in the elevator made the comment and said, you know, sorry, I forget the exact, and she goes, no, I'm Russian. How certain comments may be seen as innocent, especially with the story that's going on right now in the Tigray region. And for those of you unfamiliar, this is a very timely story because there's civil war right now in northern Ethiopia. It's in the news. There's more. It's now officially 1 year old, the conflict, the civil war there. It started in November of 2020. There are over 2 million people in the Tigray region that are displaced. While we think about, and you know, not to minimize what's going on here in Canada, because it's tragedy and environmental tragedy here in British Columbia. I shouldn't say here because I'm not in BC. We live in a country where we'll be able to get back on our feet very quickly. But sorry, and what I was just going to say is, you know, when we're talking about 2 million people in, you know, just south of Eritrea, just northern Ethiopia, we talk about cycles of violence, we talk about cycles of poverty, we talk about things then like corruption and kidnappings and civil war and breeding animosities and so on. We need to realize that the world goes beyond our comfort zone. And tonight was definitely intentionally an uncomfortable conversation. Evelyn wants to weigh in here. So Evelyn.
Judie, are there any agencies, are you now in Israel? Did you say you're now in Israel or you're in Toronto?
I'm in Toronto now.
So are there any agencies here in Toronto that are doing some sponsorship for Ethiopian Jews to come to Toronto? Because I know that I work for the I don't work, but I also volunteer with the Abraham. It's not the AGPI, it's the other Abraham group that brings in Yazidis. As a matter, okay. So it's also run by a lot of Jewish volunteers, and we bring them here. And we had a meeting the last time, and you know, they sometimes ask us for some used furniture and all that other stuff for those people that are already here. But we do have a program in that group that we put some money up for a fundraise to bring in a family or a member of a family who's already here. Do you have for Ethiopian Jews that you are?
As far as that's first of all, you know, good on you guys that you're working with the Yazidis. It's a tragic story, and anything that you can do is really amazing. You know.
So you do have for the Yazidis, but I'm wondering if there's anything for the Ethiopian Jews.
There are
Or they have already left, all of them.
No.
well, we need several hours for that, but I'll try to answer it in brief. If you're talking about coming to Canada, there are Jewish organizations, so I would imagine if people need help returning to the Jewish organizations in Toronto, in Canada and Toronto. Not aware of a large number of Ethiopian Jews that want to come to Canada. If anything, I would love to have my kids come and they don't want to. In terms of, are there people left in Ethiopia? Is that what are there Jewish people left in Ethiopia? Is that your question?
Yes.
And that's a really complicated and quite difficult subject. Because life was so difficult over the last 100 or 150 years for the Jews in Ethiopia. They would often convert. Sometimes they would convert because they had gone to the city to study and decided to become Christian or Muslim, depending on whatever they encountered. Sometimes they were forced in situations of famine, for example. There might be a situation where, since they were not allowed to own land in Ethiopia, they had to pay rent to the landowner. So very often, if there was no rain, they didn't have a crop, the only way they could have maybe survived would be to go to the church. And so you have a very large group of people called Ferris Mora, which the translation of that is people who changed their religion. And there's been a lot of back and forth with these various groups, which every time Israel airlifts a group of them, more come into the Jewish agency and Israeli camps. And there are people who've been waiting 10, 20 years. They have a very strict group of criteria to prove that they have a right to come to Israel. Otherwise, we would have all of Africa in Israel. And it's a tiny country. So they began to bring people in fairly early on. And as I said, every time they bring a group in, another group declares itself Jewish. And
Just like what happened in Russia.
as I said, yeah, it's like what happened in Russia. As I said, that, it would take hours to describe the situation. So I hope that suffices.
Yeah, another comment that I would say is that there really is racism no matter what. When you say that your children were thought to be cleaners of or housekeepers of yours, I used to bring my kids to religious school, to Hebrew religious school, and I used to get comments not even from the Jewish kids in his school, but the Jewish parents.
Yeah.
And they would ask my son Joel is here. He says, "Oh, is that your nanny?" Only because I come from a different culture. So, in this world, if you know who you are and you know what you are, I'd say to your kids, kudos to them because they know who they are. And they have, I wouldn't say the chutzpah, but they have the skin to block those situations because they know who they are and they know what they are, and that's how that's how I look at myself.
Everyone, I do want to say something. Wuditu might make a joke, but that doesn't say that it didn't hurt her.
Exactly.
She uses humor, but it hurts.
Yeah. Probably, but I laugh it off. I don't, doesn't bother me. I feel sorry for the people that makes those comments.
Look, I lived for 40 years in Israel. When I came back to Canada, I started to get people, asking me these really weird questions about being Jewish. I had totally forgotten about anti-Semitism.
Yes.
I was living in a country where almost everyone was Jewish. So yeah, it hurts. I also use You know, I also use humor to sort of fight back, or to answer. But of course, anything like that hurts, as I'm
So
sure.
I want to begin to wrap it up. I have two things. One, I want to get to Zainab's question because I think it's actually a great question again. But before we do, you mentioned CAGE, and that's an organization that I think could touch on what Evelyn is talking about. Can you give me the acronym? What does CAGE stand for? And I'll put it in the chat.
Campaign Against Abuses of Girls in Ethiopia. And it barely exists, sadly. I have a few people who I think are on tonight who are CAGE members. Basically, what I was doing was just sending out emails with what's happening to girls in Ethiopia. We would have some coffee clutches and we would meet and talk about, you know, how we would get the word out. But as much as people want to help, and every time I give a talk, there's always people jumping on the bandwagon and saying they want to help, but we go back to our lives. And so CAGE has not been successful. It does not take money. We don't accept money for CAGE. We just really want to get the word out.
So with that, I want to thank everyone, but Zainab, I'm just going to read your question. Something that she was thinking about is that, Judie, you were in Ethiopia around 1985. So she's wondering if you were...
Yeah, I was in Ethiopia after the famine. I was in Ethiopia the first time in 1989.
So, Zainab, I think that answers your question, right?
Was it about the famine? I didn't see the question. What was the question?
Zainab, do you want to...
Yeah, I was thinking that I know that Ethiopia and Eritrea had a civil war around 1990. So if you were in Ethiopia around 1989, were you aware of that situation? And I do know that a lot of Eritreans leave Ethiopia by going to Sudan, and from there they went to like safer countries. I was wondering if you were aware of that situation and if you ever thought about that. I don't know.
About the war?
The war between Ethiopia and Eritrea.
I was not, that was around 2000. The war it ended around 2000. Are you talking about the war between Tigray and Eritrea and Ethiopia?
No, I'm thinking of, I don't know if you know, Ethiopia had a country, had a war with Eritrea. Eritrea is like the neighboring,
the north.
Yeah, they had a war, and then that resulted in Eritrea splitting from Ethiopia, and they have their own state nation. I'm saying if you were there in 1989, were you aware of that situation, and did that affect anything? Did that mean anything?
Right now we're hearing, the how the Tigrayan army is moving south, and you hear the fall of each city. It feels like it's deja vu, because just before Operation Solomon, it would be 90, 89, 90, 91. It was exactly the opposite. It was the Tigrayan, it was the Eritreans and the Tigrayans coming and about to overthrow the Ethiopian regime. Yeah, it feels, and I mean, they're talking about how anybody who lives in Ethiopia, in the part of Ethiopia that is not overrun, who is from Tigray, is being banished or jailed. Well, I remember when it was the Eritreans that were being banished and jailed. It's just so sad that a country of really the nicest people that I've met, and they have been in war, back and forth, back and forth. It's mirror image always. And yeah, sure. I mean, I was there during the revolution. Yeah. Thanks for your question. It's painful. It's really painful, because I'm watching the opposite happen now, and people dying.
And so given that, and just being bystanders to it, it's from tonight, what are we going to do about it? And that's sort of the piece I want to leave us with. While I don't want to quote Stalin because of what his legacy is, he did say that, one death is a tragedy and millions is a statistic. I tell my students that million are still moms and dads, sisters and brothers, and so on. And prior to tonight at 8 o'clock, you were allowed to be ignorant of the situation because we didn't know about it. Today you do. So what are we going to do about it as retirees, as the soon to be educated, the males, the females here, and everything? How can we let this, positive change lead us? How can we bring back, whether it be Cage, for example, or the legacy of Hamlin? What can we do about it?
One of the reasons why I sort of let Cage, fade away, because I realized that the most I ever got through to people was through Cry of the Giraffe. And that's why I started writing The Kidnapped Bride. I'm only one person, I can't do everything. I would love to be able to resuscitate Cage. I would love to work with Neil. I would love to work with all of you if you would like to join. It's easy to find me. My email address is on the website, on my website. I'd be delighted with any help.
Please, because, you say you're only one person, and not to give you, a big head, but so was Martin Luther King. So was Gandhi.
Please.
So no, I'm not saying it's the same, but they were one person as well. Okay.
Yeah, I mean.
And it takes one person to cause a ripple that eventually creates a wave. And so I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. In the coming weeks, we are going to be posting free curriculum, free to download for classrooms or for your own share with people. Because for us, it's not about money, it's about the message of peace and hope and empowerment of just voices out there. I posted the link through Annika Press. Please, if you haven't bought a copy, buy a copy, buy copies for your classroom. It's a great story, but it's a true story. Not, it's based on a true, but I mean, it's a story about what people are living. And just bring it back to life, because the people today need us. This will be posted on our website in the coming weeks. And again, Judie, thank you very much. I'm going to go hug my kids a little bit more. Evelyn, I mean, I would hug your son there too, but he's, through the screen. I always like to leave every day with just spread hummus, not hate. Okay. So have a wonderful night, everyone. Thank you very much for making the time to join us, and just do great things. Take care.
Thanks to everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Samantha. Thank you, JJ.